The day my son handed me an envelope at his front door and said, "Dad, I think it's better if you don't come in." I stood there for a long moment just looking at him. Not at the envelope, at him. I'd driven 4 hours from Savannah to Atlanta for his housewarming. The house I'd put down $60,000 to help him buy. The house where my daughter-in-law had already hung curtains and set out welcome mats and invited what sounded like half of Buckhead inside. I could hear the music from the driveway. He didn't meet my eyes. Just held that envelope out like it was a peace offering, like it was supposed to explain something. "What is this?" I asked. "It's a card," he said, "from both of us. We just thought, with everything that's happened, it might be better if the party stayed small. Family only." I almost laughed. I am family. I'm the only family he has left. But I took the envelope. I walked back to my truck. I sat in that driveway for a moment listening to the bass from whatever playlist my daughter-in-law had curated for the occasion, and I drove away. I want you to understand something before I go any further. I am not a man who cries easily. I'm 63 years old. I buried my wife 11 years ago. I ran a small electrical contracting business for 32 years in coastal Georgia with nothing but a work truck, a tool belt, and a handshake reputation. I have had hard days. I know what hard feels like. That drive back down I-75 was one of the hardest of my life. My son's name is Alden. He's 34 now, and he looks exactly like his mother. Same jaw, same dark eyes, same way of going quiet when he's uncomfortable instead of just saying what he means. His mother was a gentle woman, and that quality in her was beautiful. In Alden, it has always made things complicated. His wife is Renata. No, wait, her name is Cora. Cora Whitfield, before she married him, and she made sure everyone at the rehearsal dinner knew that the Whitfields were from Charleston, and that her father had been a federal judge, because those were the two facts about herself she led with in every conversation I ever witnessed her having. I tried to like Cora. I want to be honest about that. When Alden first brought her home for Thanksgiving maybe 4 years ago, I made her grandmother's sweet potato pie from scratch because Alden had mentioned she loved sweet potato anything. I asked her questions about her work. She was in marketing, doing well, genuinely sharp. I complimented the way she'd helped Alden decorate his apartment. I tried, but Cora had a way of looking at me that I can only describe as tolerating. Like I was a piece of furniture Alden had brought from his old life that didn't quite match the new aesthetic. She never said anything outright rude. She didn't have to. It was in the way she'd redirect conversations when I started talking. The way she'd suggest they visit her parents in Charleston every holiday without ever quite making a competing suggestion to come to Savannah. The way she'd laugh just a half second too late at anything I said. Like she was performing warmth rather than feeling it. Alden saw none of it. Or he saw it and decided it was easier not to. My wife Barbara used to say that the hardest thing about loving someone is watching them choose their blind spots. She was talking about her own mother at the time, but I've thought about it a lot since. I want to back up further, because the housewarming wasn't where this story begins. It begins about 8 months before that, when Alden called me on a Sunday evening and said he and Cora had found a house. "It's in Buckhead," he said, and even through the phone I could hear the excitement trying to contain itself. Alden had wanted to live in Buckhead since he was in college. Don't ask me why, something about the tree-lined streets and the coffee shops and feeling like you'd arrived somewhere. "How much?" I asked. $580, he said. "But we've been saving, and Cora's parents are helping with some of it, and we were wondering." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. I had money. Not Whitfield federal judge money, but I'd sold the business 2 years prior and invested carefully and lived simply in the house Barbara and I had paid off 20 years ago. I had savings that were comfortable, and Alden was my only child. "How much do you need?" I asked. $60,000 would cover the down payment gap, he said. "We'd pay you back, Dad. We'd put it in writing." I told him I didn't need it in writing. He was my son. I wired him $60,000 from my savings account on a Wednesday morning. And that same afternoon, he sent me a photo of him and Cora in front of a brick colonial on a street with oak trees, and I thought, well, good, that's what the money was for. What I didn't know, what I had no way of knowing, was that Cora had already been building a case against me in her mind for years, and that case was about to be presented. The trouble started at Christmas. That was 3 months after I wired the money. I drove up to Atlanta to spend the holiday with them. Alden had decorated the new house beautifully. Pine wreaths on the door, a big tree in the front room, stockings hung on a mantle that had probably cost more than my first car. Cora's parents were flying in from Charleston on the 26th, so it was just the 3 of us on Christmas Eve. I'd brought a bottle of bourbon, a good one, and gifts, and Barbara's recipe for beef stew, because Alden has loved it since he was 8 years old. I thought it would be a nice night. It was fine. It was fine right up until after dinner, when Alden went to take a call from a friend and Cora and I were alone in the kitchen, and she said, without quite looking at me, "Can I ask you something, Edmund?" She always called me Edmund. Never Dad, never anything warmer. "Sure," I said. "Do you think Alden relies on you too much?" she asked. "Financially, I mean." I set down the dish towel I was holding. "What do you mean?" "I just think," she said carefully, that it might be healthier for him to develop more independence, more agency. I know you mean well with the money, but sometimes I wonder if it's making it harder for him to feel like he's really accomplished things on his own. I understood then that the $60,000 I had given freely, no strings, no paperwork, no expectation, was being reframed, in this woman's telling of it, as some kind of control mechanism. I gave him that money because he's my son, I said, because I had it and he needed it. That's what fathers do. She smiled. It was a careful smile. Of course, she said. I just wanted to share my perspective. I didn't say what I was thinking. I wish now that I had. When Alden came back from his call, Cora was washing dishes and I was sitting at the kitchen island, and nothing had changed visibly, but something had shifted. I felt it for the rest of the visit. I drove back to Savannah on December 26th instead of the 28th like I'd planned. Alden called that evening to make sure I'd gotten home safe. He didn't ask why I'd left early. I didn't explain. Things moved in a direction after that. Small things, accumulating. In February, Alden told me they'd decided to host Easter at their place rather than come to Savannah. Fine. In March, he mentioned that Cora had suggested they start seeing a financial advisor together and that they were trying to establish better boundaries around money. I noticed the phrasing. Not their money, just money. I let it go. In April, I asked if I could come up for his birthday weekend. There was a pause before he said, "This year's kind of busy, Dad. Cora has a work thing. Can we do a dinner sometime in May instead?" We did not do a dinner in May. I'm not a man who chases. I was raised to give people their space, to not crowd or cling or beg. My father was that kind of man, and I learned it from him. But I will tell you that each of those small moments, the Easter, the birthday, the postponed dinner, felt like a door closing quietly, not slamming, just drifting shut in a way you keep hoping is the wind. The housewarming was in June. Alden called 2 weeks before to tell me about it. The excitement in his voice was back, real and unguarded, like when he was a kid. He described the backyard setup they'd planned, the caterer, the playlist, how many people were coming. I asked if I could bring anything. He said, "Just yourself, Dad, just come." So I came. 4 hours in a June heat that was already getting mean by 9 in the morning. I had a card with a check inside, another $5,000. A housewarming gift, because what else do you give your son for a house you already helped him buy? And he met me at the door with an envelope and told me it was better if I didn't come in. I read the card later that night, sitting in a Holiday Inn off the highway because I'd booked a room assuming I'd be staying nearby for the weekend. It was a Hallmark card, one of those generic thinking of you ones. And inside Cora had written in her precise handwriting that they valued our relationship and hoped I understood they needed space to establish their home the way they envisioned it, and that they hoped we could plan a proper visit soon. Alden had signed his name underneath, just his name, no message of his own. I put the card down on the bedside table. I sat with it for a while. Then I called my accountant. His name is Ray Dunbar, been doing my taxes for 20 years, good man. I told him I needed to look at some things. He asked what kind of things. I told him I'd explain in the morning. I slept about 3 hours. Not from anger, I want to be clear about that. The feeling wasn't quite anger. It was something older and quieter. It was grief, I think. The grief of watching someone become a stranger. But underneath that grief there was something else. Something steady and clear. It was the understanding that I had let things drift too far in one direction, and that this moment, this Holiday Inn, this Hallmark card, was the end of that particular road. By morning I had a plan, not a revenge plan. I don't think of it that way, and I don't want you to either. It was more like a correction, a rebalancing. A decision to stop funding a life in which I was not welcome. First, I called my bank and placed a stop payment on the check I'd put in the card. It hadn't been deposited yet, I checked. $5,000 returned to where it came from. Then I called Ray and told him what I was considering. He listened carefully, asked a few questions, and said, "Edmund, you lent that $60,000 without documentation. You understand you may not see it again." "I know," I said. "And you understand that ending financial support could damage your relationship with your son permanently?" "My son ended something when he handed me that envelope," I said. "I'm just responding." Ray was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right, what do you need?" What I needed was to review every financial commitment I'd been making to Alden's life over the past several years, not just the down payment. There was a monthly contribution I'd been making to a joint account we'd set up when Barbara died, originally meant for Alden's graduate school costs. He'd finished his degree 4 years ago, but I'd kept putting money in, old habit, thinking he might need it for something. There was $2,000 a month going into that account. I contacted the bank and suspended the transfers. There was also the life insurance policy I'd taken out on myself when Alden was born, a sizable whole life policy that I'd continued funding faithfully. Cora was listed as co-beneficiary, a change Alden had asked me to make when they got engaged. "It just makes sense, Dad. She's my family." I called the insurance company on a Monday morning and requested the change paperwork. I removed Cora. I kept Alden. I added 2 small charitable organizations Barbara had loved, a literacy nonprofit out of Savannah and the local animal shelter where we used to volunteer together. I did not call Alden to explain any of this. He had not called me to explain handing me a card at his front door. 3 weeks passed. I went back to my regular life in Savannah. I had coffee with my neighbor Harold. No, wait, my neighbor's name is Pete, and Pete and I have shared a back fence for 17 years, and he is one of the only people who knew Barbara well enough to still talk about her the right way. I walked on the beach in the evening. I played cards on Thursday nights with some men from my old trade association. I was fine, mostly. Then Alden called. The transfer stopped, he said. He meant the monthly deposits. Yes, I said. There was a silence. Did you mean for that to happen? Yes. Another silence, longer. Dad, what's going on? Cora's really upset. I noticed which one of them was upset in his telling. Cora might want to think about what message was sent when I was handed a card at the door of the house I helped pay for, I said. And what message I'm sending in return. He started to say something about how I didn't understand, about how it had been complicated, about how Cora had been going through a lot. I listened for a minute, then I said, Alden, I love you. I will always love you. But I am 63 years old and I drove 4 hours and I was turned away at the door. I think you understand what I'm telling you. He was quiet. When you're ready to have a real conversation, I said. I'm here. I hung up. What I found out in the weeks after that, not immediately, it took some time for the picture to fill in, was that Cora's financial situation was more precarious than she had ever let on. Her parents were not helping with the mortgage, not really. There had been a one-time gift of $20,000 at closing, but they were not in a position to continue contributing, something Cora had apparently been keeping from Alden. The house was carrying a significant monthly payment, and the joint account I'd been contributing to had been quietly covering a gap between their lifestyle and their actual income. Dinners out, a weekend trip to Charleston every few months, new furniture, a gym membership at one of those expensive Atlanta places. I learned this not from snooping, but because Alden eventually came to me. It took about 2 months. He called on a Sunday evening, same as always, and his voice was different, quieter, less defended. Can I come to Savannah? He asked. He came on a Thursday, alone. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd helped him with homework 30 years ago, where Barbara used to serve dinner on Sunday nights, and he laid it all out. The finances, the gap, Cora's pressure, the way he'd been caught between two worlds and had taken the path of least resistance so many times that he'd lost track of where he stood. She told me it would be easier if we created some distance, he said. From you. She said you were too involved. That the money made it complicated. The money didn't make anything complicated, I said. I gave it freely. She made it complicated. He didn't argue with that. He sat there with his hands around a coffee mug and he looked, for a moment, exactly like the boy he used to be. Before college, before Atlanta, before Cora. He looked like the kid who used to sit in the passenger seat of my work truck on summer mornings and ask me how electricity worked. I'm sorry, Dad, he said. I'm sorry about the housewarming. I shouldn't have done that. I looked at my son for a long time. No, I said. You shouldn't have. The thing about correction is that it doesn't always look like forgiveness right away. I didn't write him a new check. I didn't restart the transfers. I told him I loved him and I was glad he came and that we would figure out what came next together, but that some things had changed and we needed to be honest about what those things were. He nodded. He understood, I think, better than he let on. Cora and Alden had a hard several months after that. I won't pretend I know all the details. That's between them. But I know they had some serious conversations about money and honesty and what they actually wanted their life to look like. I know they sold some things. I know Cora took on a second client base for her marketing work. I know they had to have conversations with her parents that were long overdue. I don't know if they'll make it. I hope they do, because Alden loves her, and I remember what it is to love someone that much. But I had to learn, that loving my son doesn't mean I fund a life where I am not welcome. Those are two different things, and for too long I had confused them. That summer, almost exactly a year after I drove away from that housewarming, I went on a trip. I hadn't traveled since Barbara died. She'd always wanted to see the Pacific Northwest. She used to cut pictures out of magazines, Oregon coastline, the Cascades, little bed and breakfasts tucked into pine forests. I'd always said we'd get there. We didn't get there. I booked 2 weeks in late July. I flew into Portland and rented a car and drove south down Highway 101 with no particular plan. I stopped in small towns and ate at diners where people talked to you at the counter. I walked on beaches where the water was cold and gray and nothing like Savannah and beautiful for being entirely different. I drove up into the mountains one afternoon and sat on a rock looking out at a valley that went on for 100 miles, and I talked to Barbara for a while, the way I still do sometimes when I need to say something out loud. I told her about Alden. I told her about the housewarming and the card and the transfers and the kitchen conversation and all of it. I told her I didn't know if I'd handled it right. She would have had opinions. She always had opinions about the right way to handle things. But sitting there in that quiet, I felt something settle in me. Not resolution exactly. More like acceptance. The acceptance that loving someone doesn't protect you from being hurt by them. That sometimes the most dignified thing you can do is simply stop accepting less than you deserve and trust that the people worth keeping in your life will find their way back to you. Alden called me while I was in Astoria, just to talk. We talked for 40 minutes about nothing in particular, a podcast he'd been listening to, a problem he was having with his car, a memory of a fishing trip we took when he was 12. It was the most like ourselves we'd been in years. Before we hung up, he said, "I'm glad you went on that trip, Dad." "Me too," I said. "Mom would have loved it out there. She really would have," I said. "I'm back in Savannah now, back in the house, back to my mornings with coffee on the back porch watching the light come up over the marsh. My life is quieter than it used to be, smaller in some ways, but I've come to understand that small isn't the same as empty. I reinstated part of the monthly transfer, half of what it was before. Not because anyone asked me to, but because it's what I decided was right. There's a difference between being taken advantage of and choosing to help. I know the difference now. I don't think I did before." The housewarming was not the story I thought I was in when I turned out of that driveway with the envelope on the passenger seat beside me. I thought I was in a story about rejection, about what happens when the people you sacrificed for decide they don't need you anymore. But that wasn't it. That was the middle of a different story. One about a man who had given so much for so long that he'd forgotten to ask whether any of it was truly wanted, or just expected. About what happens when you finally stop and let the silence do the talking. About what comes back when you create the space for it. My son came back. He's still finding his way, so am I. And that October, when Alden and Cora came down to Savannah for the weekend, the first time they'd visited in over 2 years, Cora walked into my house carrying a bouquet of flowers she'd picked up somewhere along the highway, and she handed them to me and said quietly, "Thank you for having us, Edmund." It wasn't an apology, I didn't need it to be. I put the flowers in the vase Barbara always kept on the kitchen windowsill, and I asked them if they were hungry, and we sat down at that kitchen table together and ate a meal. That was enough. Some days, that is everything.